Chancy and the Grand Rascal by Fleischman, Chapter 16, Sun Dance. Clouds of dust were rising on the road ahead as if cattle were stampeding, but it was a stampede of another sort. Settlers with their household goods piled helter-skelter on wagons were on the run and driving their livestock before them. Soon the buckboard was engulfed in sheep and milk cows and hogs and geese. Uncle Will pulled to one side of the onrushing horde and stopped a small-eyed man with a mule. "What's going on? Indians! They're on the warpath and riding this way. Turn back." Chancy and Indiana exchanged quick glances. "Mercy," she whispered. Uncle Will was unperturbed. "We're heading for Sundance." "We're coming from Sundance," said the man on the mule. "I'm the mayor, but I just resigned. The whole town almost has got up and left." The ex-mayor of Sundance was gone. Uncle Will stopped a man driving an ox team. "We're looking for Miss Russell and two youngsters, Mirandy and Jamie Dundee. Can you point them out to us?" "The young schoolmarm, you won't find them here. The boy is too sick to move, and Miss Russell and Mirandy, they won't leave." Uncle Will cracked the whip, and the buckboard was soon hurtling through the dust and confusion. Before long, the prairie town was before them, standing empty and silent under the Kansas sun. Chancy had seen bigger towns, but none he was more anxious to set foot in. He reckoned they'd snatch up Mirandy and little Jamie and Miss Russell and be gone before the Indians made a nuisance of themselves. Uncle Will kept the whip popping in the air. Soon the buckboard pulled up along the broad dirt street. There wasn't an Indian in sight. The stores, with their tall false fronts, were locked and the windows boarded up. A man with a rifle was standing on the roof of the hotel. "Where's Miss Russell?" "Where's Miss Russell?" Uncle Will called up. "Those that are staying have gone over to the new schoolhouse." He pointed to a building that stood on the slight rise at the north end of town. Uncle Will swung the buckboard around, and after another moment, Chancy and Indiana jumped down. The schoolhouse door was barricaded, but a nearby window slid open. Behind it, framed like a picture, stood a slim, green-eyed woman with a shotgun in her hands. "What in the name of common sense do you think you're doing?" she yelled at Uncle Will. Chancy and Indiana were covered with dust, and she hardly looked at them. "You get those children out of town this instant." "Why, ma'am, we just arrived." "Indians are on the warpath and heading this way. Now you get." Chancy recognized her at once, and so did Indiana. It was Miss Russell, still young and pretty, but in a fury. She began giving Uncle Will such a tongue-lashing that they didn't dare interrupt. Finally, Uncle Will said, "Are you the schoolmarm?" "Yes." "Miss Russell?" "Yes. Now get, ma'am, if you'll just lower your eyes again. You might notice Chancy Dundee and his sister Indiana. They're a mite dusty, but that's them. They're standing here busting to say howdy." Miss Russell's face went red as paint, and her fury melted into a breathless smile. "Chancy!" she gasped. "Indiana!" They were through the window in seconds. The room was an armed camp. 4 families with grown sons were staying on to fight the Indians from the schoolhouse. Suddenly, everyone seemed to be talking at once. "Where's Mirandy? Where's little Jamie?" Jamie was rolled up in blankets beside the large new pot-bellied stove and burning with fever. He was asleep, but Mirandy was missing. The blacksmith and his boys were out looking for her. She was hiding for fear Miss Russell would send her away. Chancy and Indiana approached the stove silently and gazed down at their 7-year-old brother. His cheeks were aglow with fever, and his sandy hair was damp with sweat. Chancy felt a throb in his throat. He wanted to let Jamie know that they were there, that they were together again, but Jamie seemed 1,000 miles off, and they spoke in whispers. "The doctor said we don't dare move him out," Miss Russell said softly. Chancy took a deep breath, and then his eye lit on the new stove, standing like a barrel on legs. Why, if he were looking for a place to hide... "Mirandy," he said. "By dogs, Mirandy, you come out of there." All eyes in the room turned to the stove. There was a breathless silence, and then the iron lid began to lift, and there was 9-year-old Mirandy rising like a reluctant jack-in-the-box. Her eyes were large and wet, but fierce. "I won't go," she said, giving her pigtails a toss. "You can't make me go. You can't make me leave Jamie behind." "Mirandy," Chancy said in a kind of awe. "You're contrary as a mule in a mud puddle, just like Indiana, and you looked like her, too." You everlasting scamp," Uncle Will laughed, lifting her out of the stove. "Nobody's leaving Jamie behind. Now meet your brother Chancy and your sister Indiana, and when you get time, you can say hello to your Uncle Will." It appeared to Chancy that Mirandy's eyes would jump out of her head. She was speechless, but then Indiana gave her the tiger kitten, and soon the 3 Dundees were talking away merrily, careful not to wake little Jamie. Finally, Uncle Will said, Chancy, give the school bell a ring and come with me. We'd better look after those Indians. The tolling of the bell brought all the men left in town, and they gathered outside the schoolhouse. Gents, said Uncle Will, this is your town, but maybe you'll excuse me for butting in. There are women and young'uns in the schoolhouse, and if there's a lot of shooting, someone is bound to get hurt. But I calculate we can handle those Indians without firing a shot. Chancy, you get up on the roof of the hotel there and yell out if you see dust from the south or the west. Chancy wasted no time. Once on the roof, he could see for miles around. Not an Indian was in sight. Glancing back toward Abilene, he made out the great cattle herds speckling the distant prairie. Suddenly, below him on the street, 5 men leaped on their horses. They rode out of town with Uncle Will waving them on. That struck Chancy as downright astonishing. Was Uncle Will proposing to fight the Indians single-handed? The rattle of the horsemen quickly faded away. A silence settled over the town. Uncle Will locked the buckboard inside the livery stable and came out with an armload of rawhide ropes. You folks in the schoolhouse, he yelled. Don't show your guns or fire a shot unless you've got no choice. One by one, he threw rawhide coils up to Chancy on the roof, and then he sat on the hitching rail in the shade and smoked a tar-black cigar. It was well past noon, and after almost an hour, Chancy began to think the Indians would never show up. Maybe they couldn't find the town, it being so small. Still, he kept his eyes peeled. He watched a blackbird come flapping down on a distant fence as if to wait for the coming battle. Suddenly, Chancy noticed brown smoke rising on the southwest. Dust. Indians, he shouted. They're coming, they're coming. Uncle Will tossed away the butt of his cigar. He straightened the hawk's feather in his hatband and climbed to the hotel roof with Chancy. For a long moment, they watched the dust rushing toward them like a ground fire. Soon the dust turned into Indians, and Uncle Will said, Keep down and out of sight. I don't want to have to pluck arrows out of your hide. Chancy took a last glance at the schoolhouse. It sat white and silent under the sun. Then a foxy red movement caught the corner of his eye. He peered downward and froze. Calamity stood across the street, pecking at a tuft of grass along the raised boardwalk. Calamity, get back! The rooster went on scratching and pecking. Chancy threw his legs over the edge of the roof and dropped to the wooden awning below. Uncle Will gave him an angry shout, but Chancy didn't pause. He'd snatch up Calamity and make it to the schoolhouse before the war party plunged into town. Within seconds, he had slid down an awning post to the street and saw Indiana rush out of the schoolhouse window. Get back, Chancy shouted. Calamity's got loose. I know that, Uncle Will's voice cracked like thunder. Clear off the street, both of you. Chancy and Indiana converged on Calamity, but in the sudden excitement, the rooster ducked under the slat boardwalk. Chancy sprawled on his stomach and reached an arm underneath. The rooster retreated deeper beneath the walk. Calamity, Chancy bristled. Come here, confound you, Calamity. Chick, chick, Indiana called desperately. Here, Calamity. You get back to the schoolhouse, Chancy declared. No, by dogs, I never saw such a contrary sister. Confound you both, Uncle Will shouted, heaving a rope down the side of the hotel. Grab hold, hear me, that bird can take care of himself. Chancy could now hear the rattle of approaching hooves. He yanked Indiana across the street with him. They reached the dangling rope, and Uncle Will hauled them in like fish. His eyes were blazing. By the eternal, if there was time, I'd give you both a walloping. Heads down. Chancy and Indiana crouched behind the false front. Why in tarnation did you let Calamity out of his cage? Chancy whispered. Little Jamie's head looked so hot. I thought it would feel good if Calamity fanned him. Then you and Uncle Will were shouting about the Indians coming, and I forgot about him. In a split second, painted warriors came surging into town, yelling and war-whooping. The sounds alone raised the hair on Chancy's scalp. He found a chink in the boards to watch through. The Indians rode bareback, racing and yelping, almost to the schoolhouse and back. Then they began milling about as if disappointed to find the town abandoned. That's not many Indians to my count, Chancy whispered, trying to take some hope to it. Trying to take some hope in it. They'll do, muttered Uncle Will. 15, but they don't look like Indian ponies to me. They're saddle horses. Indiana found a chink of her own to watch through. Poor Calamity, she said softly. The braves slid off their mounts and burst out laughing, and Uncle Will said, By ginger, they don't sound like Indians either. Chancy pressed his eye tight against the chink in the false front. One of the fiercely painted men below was guffawing so hard an eagle feather flew out of his hair. Boys, he laughed, Didn't I tell you the trick would work? Just send a man ahead, yell an engine, and everybody runs. Looks like the town is ours. By the eternal, Will scowled. Those aren't Indians, they're white men. Give Seven Eyes the signal, said the hoarse, laughing man below. Let's help ourselves. Jayhawkers, Chancy breathed, looking at Indiana. Seven Eyes Smith and his gang. One of the outlaws fired a rifle in the air, and soon a large man driving an empty freight wagon rode through the dust into town. The gang began looting the stores. Uncle Will held his fire. The schoolhouse held its fire. The Jayhawkers broke into the general store, the bank, the harness shop, the dry goods store. Soon the wagon was piling up with blankets, kegs of butter, 2 new saddles, bolts of cloth, canned oysters, and lanterns. All the while, Seven Eyes Smith sat on the wagon, surveying all before him like a king, and spat tobacco juice. Looks mean enough to eat off the same plate with a rattlesnake, don't he? Uncle Will said, but he hardly seemed to be paying attention to the looting below. His eyes were fixed on the prairie beyond town. Chauncey simmered. Seven Eyes Smith and his gang were plucking the town clean. Oh, they were infernal rascals, but Uncle Will was a grand rascal, wasn't he? What was he waiting for? We're not going to let them Jayhawkers get clean away, are we? Chancy said finally. Oh, they're aiming straight for the jailhouse. Only they don't know it yet. I just hope they don't get anxious and leave ahead of time. Ahead of time? Why, Chancy, I suddenly decided we ought to go into the cattle business, and I declare, here come our bevies now. Chancy had heard the distant bellowing of cattle all along without paying any more attention to it than had the outlaws themselves, but now he looked out beyond the rooftops of town and saw longhorns converging on Sundance like a flow of mud. Drovers, with their hats in the air, were whipping them along. Chancy saw Seven Eyes Smith cock his head as the sounds grew nearer. His gang was carrying loot to the wagon from all parts of town. Boys, he yelled out, the wagon's full enough. Sounds like an earthquake heading this way. Let's disappear. Hold on, Seven Eyes, there's heaps more yet, and it's ours for the taking. Look here what I found. The Jayhawker pulled a live chicken out of his shirt. Indiana gave a gasp. It was Calamity. We'll have us some rooster soup for supper, Seven Eyed Smith grinned. Let's ride, boys. The Jayhawker tossed Calamity into the wagon. Chancy and Indiana watched in quiet horror. Uncle Will cautioned them with a gesture of his hand. The outlaws rounded up their horses. Seven Eyes Smith cracked the whip over his team, and they started out of town. But they were too late. A herd of Texas cattle came trotting around the corner, blocking the way with a wall of tossing horns. The Jayhawkers spun around and started for the west end of town. At once, longhorns were rushing in on them. They turned again, and now cattle were bellowing and pouring through every crevice in town. It appeared to Chancy that every cow on the prairie was on the run and heading into Sundance. The outlaws quickly found themselves jammed in the middle, as tightly packed as corn on the cob. Uncle Will drew his gun. I figured on Indians, but those Jayhawkers will do. I sent the boys to spread word to the cow camps that there was a darned fool in Sundance who'd pay $30 a head for longhorns until his money ran out. Indiana kept watching from the chink in the boards. Look what Calamity has done, Chancy. Calamity had taken a fluttering leap and was roosting on Seven Eyes' left shoulder. But suddenly Chancy saw the Jayhawker peering up at the false front as he sensed people up there. Seven Eyes raised the shotgun off his lap. Down, Uncle Will ordered. He's going to blast. Chancy saw a desperate opportunity. At the top of his voice, he yelled, Fan me, Calamity! Fan me, Calamity! Instantly, the rooster's wings threshed in Seven Eyes' face. The outlaw almost fumbled his weapon. In the next instant, Uncle Will had the drop on him. That'll do, he shouted. Easy down there. If a gun goes off, those longhorns will stampede, and we'll have to scrape you boys up with a shovel. Easy, you gents ain't going anywhere. Now kindly toss your guns to the ground, if you can find the ground, and I'll try to get you out of that infernal mess you got yourselves in. The drovers were an hour making elbow room of the street. By that time, Uncle Will had dropped the wooden awning that ran over the storefronts and rescued the Jayhawkers one by one. He tossed out the rawhide lasso, pulled them up out of their saddles, and hauled them in. Indiana held the six-shooter in both hands while Uncle Will and Chancy trussed them up in bolts of calico lifted from the wagon top below. Calamity had burrowed deep under the plunder, and only after the cattle were thinned out could he be rescued. By then, horse soldiers had arrived from Abilene with news that the $1,500 reward had been posted that morning for the capture of Seven Eyes Smith and his gang. Uncle Will shoved back his hat. "Young'uns, it looks like our fortune is made," he said. "Gentlemen, you'll find the rascals stacked like cordwood on the awning, tied up pretty as you please." And then he turned back to Chancy and Indiana. "You two are due for a hiding, but I declare Calamity did make himself useful." "Perishing useful," Indiana said. "Saved our lives, most likely," Chancy added. "Those are extenuating circumstances," Uncle Will grinned. "And Chancy, that was quick of you to get those wings flapping. By ginger, you're getting more like me every day." "Yes, sir. Now what are we going to do with all that reward money?" The answer wasn't long in coming. The drovers were looking everywhere for the fool paying $30 a head for longhorns. Uncle Will had figured the woodyard money and the clock money would buy about 2 bevies. But now there was the reward money, and he'd given his word. He burst into a huge laugh. He had outfoxed himself. "Boys, that's a mighty tall price, but I never broke my word in my life," he said, and began writing out IOUs. When he returned to the schoolhouse with Chancy, he owned a herd of 50 Texas Longhorns. "How'll you ever sell 'em?" said Chancy. "Why, if I can sell clocks to people who don't care what time it is, I reckon I can sell a few head of overpriced beef." Little Jamie's fever broke that night. His eyes were open, and he looked at Chancy and Indiana standing beside his bed. But they were complete strangers to him. Not even Miss Russell could make him accept the visitors as his own kin. For a long while, Chancy found it hard to speak. Finally, he smiled and dug in his pocket and held up his polished buckeye. "I brought this all the way from Ohio, Jamie. Why, if you weren't my own brother, I wouldn't part with it. It's powerful good luck. It's yours, Jamie, and look here. I've got cat's eyes, just like you. You can ask Indiana if that's not the truth. Cat's eyes run in our family, you know." Little Jamie only gazed at him. "And that's not all," said Chancy, digging in his pocket again. "See this? It's a bullet that was shot in the war. You can have it." But Jamie didn't respond even to that, and Miss Russell wiped his forehead with a damp cloth. Finally, Chancy showed off the fine 4-pound axe. "See this, Jamie? This was our pa's own axe. Imagine that. It belonged to him before you and me were born. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd want me to give it to you, being that we're brothers. Why, soon you can jump out of bed and I'll teach you how to use it, by dogs. I'll have you chopping a cord of wood in a day, same as me. Yes, sir, this axe is yours now, Jamie. Do you think I'd give you pa's axe if you weren't my own kin?" The gleam of the axe caught Jamie's eye. He stared at it a long while, and then his gaze slid back to Chancy and Indiana and Mirandy. A smile rose to his cat's eyes. In a dry, raspy voice, he said, "How do, Indiana? Howdy, Chancy. You were a precious long time getting here." "I declare," said Chancy, "if the Dundees aren't contrary, they're plain contentious." But he was smiling. All the Dundees were together again. "The trouble with Kansas," Jamie protested some days later, "is you can hardly find wood to chop." Chancy liked living on the Great Plains, but Uncle Will had changed his mind about roosting in one place. "I'm a-comin' and goin', man," he said that night at supper time. "Once that herd is sold, we'll be leaving, Miss Russell. You've been mighty good to care for Mirandy and Jamie, but there's a heap of places I'd like to show them." Miss Russell turned instantly pale. "I was hoping you wouldn't take them away from me." Chancy, Indiana, Mirandy, and Jamie sat silently at the table. "I don't want to." Uncle Will seemed unable to find a place for his eyes. "But now that they're together again, I don't intend to let them get split up again." "Why, Sundance is a fine place to live. It's growing every minute." "I can see that, but it never has come natural to me to stay in one place. And you won't want a lot of young'uns around when you marry that cattleman who sent for you." "Him? Cattleman?" Mirandy blurted out. "He raised goats and smelled like 'em, too." Uncle Will cleared his throat, and Miss Russell got up for the coffee pot. Chancy hoped he would change his mind. He liked Miss Russell. With Indiana and Mirandy and Jamie about, Sundance had already begun to seem like home. The silence that had settled over the table was broken by a knock at the door. In came the blacksmith and several men of the town with broad grins on their faces. "Excuse us for walking in on supper," said the blacksmith, "but some news won't wait. Will Buckthorn, the folks in Sundance are mighty grateful to you, and you being a big cattleman now, why, the town council, that's us, we just voted you mayor." Mayor? The last one we had rode out of town on a mule and ain't come back. You want the job? It don't hardly pay at all, but it's mighty dignified. Chancy had never seen Uncle Will so stunned. He couldn't find his vest pockets to put a thumb in. And then he looked from Chancy to Indiana to Mirandy and Jamie. If he had ever hoped to see pride in their eyes, he saw it now. And then his glance passed to Miss Russell. She had almost stopped breathing. Mayor, he said suddenly, gentlemen, I've been everything from mule skinner to a clock peddler, but that's one job I never tried. Mayor, you said. Well, I calculate I'd make a fine mayor. Gentlemen, I accept. By the eternal, a family man who'd leave an up-and-coming town like this hasn't all the brains the law allows. And that is the end. So that was a decent Western. I am not in love with the idea that had those been Indians attacking the town and not white men, the story would have been fine with them just all being killed. And I have censored words before when I've read. You'll notice there are certain racial slurs I don't say. I said gypsy reading this story. Let me know how you feel about that. I'm 90% toward not saying that word anymore on my videos, but I'd be happy to dialogue about that. Anyway, that is the end of Chancy and the Grand Rascal, and I will see you in the next read aloud.